Associate Professor, Practice of Art History in the Department of Arts and Humanities at NYU Abuظbي, and Wendä Shbut, Professor of Art History and the Director of the Contemporary Arab and Muslim Studies Initiatives at the University of North Texas. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to speak at the art talks, all great talks. There's so much happening. I feel like I'm in the Olympic marathon, one event after the other, so sort of breathless. And what we're looking in art history is a downtime to think about what's happening. I wish we have more of it. But when we look at the global, I like to say that the word global is problematic in some ways, but for now we can define it. We should always define it further and talk about art history within a global context. And to me, what that means is not only teaching art history in relation to the West, but rather in relation to art from anywhere. And that would include particularly a region that we have not given enough thought for, the region of the East, the Far East, Southeast Asia, and our neighbors, yet the research that we have so far published on art from this region does not relate the art of this region with its neighbor enough. And that we need to pay more attention to our neighborhood of the Arab world. And so in that sense, this is how I'm looking at the global in that. And I prefer not to discuss the museum now and stick to the art history. Definitely. Because that would I think it takes a different approach and different discourse.
Definitely. Again, I echo Selwa's thanks to giving us the opportunity to debate this topic. Like Selwa said, the notion of the global is fraught and problematic in various ways, but at least for now, we, after having abandoned or decided to reject the universal and the international because of the baggage they brought with them. So we are stuck with the global, for better or for worse, and we just need to sort of make sense of it. For me, to think of the global, and giving that, when Salwa and I started talking about the art of this region, it was prior to all this sort of, interest. Yeah. And so it was even more difficult to give it its own identity before we can even globalize it. But as someone who teaches in a Western university and in the US, to me, to globalize art history is by shifting not only, as Salwa said, contextualizing it within its own region and neighbors, but actually shifting the focus or the point of reference from the Euro-American to the rest of the world. So I've decided, for example, lately, to stop any reference or any comparison to Europe, for example, when I teach in my classes or when I write myself. So it is something that we negotiate as we go. We don't really have a specific way of dealing with it yet, but at least we know that we need to do something about it and shift the axis of focus.
And within a classroom setting, since the both of you are professors, how is it that you bring this about, and especially in Western institutions like NYU or the University of North Texas? It's such a specific subject to, say, the region that we're looking at. What does it look like for the students when they come in? And I think art is something that you need to be able to relate to. So if it's something that's so foreign, almost alien, what is it how do you contextualize that back to them and back to the institution?
Well, the interesting about contemporary art, that it doesn't seem to be alien to anyone from anywhere, wherever the art is coming from. Because if we look at the diaspora artists, already we have this notion of globalizing the production, the discourse, the references within anywhere you want to speak of. So, but to teach, of course, is a very different story because we need books, we need literature. So to teach modernism, for example, which is on the curricula of our universities as modernism, with the description that talks about basically, European modernism and even a postmodernist course. So it is a challenge to try to, bring different direction to the point. For me, I no longer use a book. I use articles and essays, even for undergraduate courses, from various places and focus on events. So, with modernism, I experimented with teaching by decades. So, the 1930s around the world, key points of cities where major developments were happening. My goal now is to try to get the students to leave the course with more questions than answers that they started with, yeah.
Fantastic. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is a challenge. Like you will notice that for the last 5 years, more and more courses are titled Global Contemporary Art or World Contemporary Art. And there are a few more now emerging as global modernities. But as Nada said, we need to define. Each situation is different. I am fortunate at NYU Abu Dhabi that I have the freedom to design the courses. There are certain parameters, of course, for any professor, but in teaching art from this region, I had sort of the liberty to choose what I want to teach. And I started with a course that I've been teaching for now almost 10 years, which is has a very general title of Art of the Arab World. And soon I found out that it was not going to be possible to do a chronological survey, because that's exactly what we are trying to move away from, these survey courses, but rather focus more on a course that looks, for example, at abstraction. And teaching that as a core course was an amazing experience for me in Abu Dhabi at NYU, because also we have over 100 internationalities at the university. And so my class is very diverse. And I invite the students to contribute from their country. And when all of a sudden they discover that abstraction is not just modern art, but it also goes back to ancient art and art from religious art that's abstract. So it opens up a conversation that everyone can share in. And I think that's one way of looking at it. And as Nada said, the contemporary is so interdisciplinary now that there are many doors you can enter into this teaching of a contemporary course. As you can see, of course, today we had students from my class meet with 3 artists, Joanna Haji Thomas, Baha Ma'moon, and Ala Yunus. And we had a wonderful conversation. And the students, I realized as the artists were speaking, that the students got more and more engaged with these different topics. So looking at the strata of, even looking how artists operate almost like archaeologists at times, mining different topics. And that reflects also on their learning, how they need to mine and be independent learners, more or less. So teaching is sort of, at this stage, this topic is experimental in many ways. And as Neda said, when we started, there were hardly any publications. And we have to, there are reasons for that I'm not getting to later.
With that, before we get into the publications and the texts that are obviously lacking within understanding our history of the region, I was looking to see the place of conferences. NYU Abu through you had a conference looking specifically at abstraction. What is the role of these conferences in creating this art history?
That's a very good example. That was a conference that was organized in collaboration with AMCA, the Association of Modern and Contemporary Art of the Arab World, and Nada is a founding director and president of the organization, which we founded actually around 2007, I think. And so the role of these conferences is that it gives a platform for the young scholars to share new ideas, to test their ideas, and also meet with established scholars and exchange and network and all that. So in this particular conference, what we try to do is extend the conference for 2 days And invite PhD candidates from different universities through a selection process. And they spent 2 days we were very fortunate to have the support of the Virgil Art Foundation and Mr. Al-Qasimi in offering us not only a part of the funding, but also the opportunity to work with their collection. So they had sort of a special time, and Wendell, I think, can speak more about that as well.
I mean, as Sylvia said, I mean, these conferences, what AMCA tries to do is to, I mean, that's initially when we formed it, we wanted everyone who is interested in the topic to have a forum, because Sylvia and I know how hard it was to start even the conversation about these topics before. And so now there is a forum and a support for the graduate students, for the young scholars. I mean, we both have students who graduated and are teaching now, which means, you know, the conversation is extended. And so to have forums like the one we had for the AMCA conference, and particularly graduate workshops where students are able, the graduate students, particularly from different parts of the world where you don't have a collection of Arab art or art from the Arab world, to be able to see the works, to be able, you know, Sultan was so generous with us. Students were able to handle the work wearing gloves, so not to worry. But, you know, to actually be that close to the work, it gives them opportunities of also dreaming up new ideas for, you know, proposals for research. So it's really very important to develop the work or develop scholarship to be able to have access to the works, to be able to study them instead of just writing about them from far, you know, and sort of writing in the general. I think we're at a point in the scholarship of modern Arab art where we really need to step away from the general sort of theoretical and focus on artists and their body of work and do the traditional art history sort of, you know, discipline material for them.
How do you define the pivotal moments? I mean, prior to all of these kind of obvious situations that we have, you know, here in our region, the Gulf, looking at, you know, the opening of museums or having art fairs and these platforms that are very much in the forefront. Initially, when the both of you were studying and trying to bring this subject of art history of the region, like looking at the Levant or Iraq in the modernist period, what were you looking for to highlight, and how did you make those decisions as to what it was that needed to be highlighted as the root of, you know, art history between these two places within the Arab world?
Such a simple question. This is actually a very complicated question, but I can give you an example of what we've been dealing with for the Modern Art in the Arab World primary document book that me and Annika Lenz and Sarah Rogers have been co-editing for the international program at Museum of Modern Art, New York, where we look at a period from 1880 to 1980 and try to, and we have 125 texts that we've chosen that sort of intersect from these sort of key points that you were talking about. What we looked at to define these moments was what the artists were saying and writing. You know, so it was pretty much defined by the artists themselves and their production, their discussions, the roundtable discussions. Some of those sort of, you know, correlate with political moments of shifts, but some of them actually also, you know, just indirectly related to the political. So it's you know, I mean, that is debatable, and you know, what we did for the MoMA book is one way of locating these, and there have been challenges. Even AMCA did a conference at one point where we looked at the 1967 as a pivotal point. To what extent did it really, you know, cause a shift in aesthetics or in the production of art? So, I mean, from my point of view, you can't really pinpoint specific moments, but there are some obvious, you know, periods of time where there are intersections among the region particularly. But to look at Iraq, for example, I mean, there's no debating that 2003 is a pivotal moment. Exactly. So there are ones that sort of, you know, stare you in the eyes easier than others.
Yeah, I think it's for a book like that or any other book, the writing of art history is in crisis now in some ways, because I'm talking here about the modern period that Neda is speaking about. And that is because of the rare number of very few books actually on the subject that we have access to. So, and in order to understand why this happened, we need to look at the history of teaching art history. For example, in a country like Egypt, there is almost 100 million people, there are, of course, thousands of artists. And it's important to note that the first program dedicated to teaching art history at the MA and the PhD was established only in 1998. Prior to that, the focus was on art practice. Of course, there were professors who probably taught a course here and there on Egyptian art, Coptic art. Ancient Egyptian art is a very popular major in Egypt until now. And these courses are taught at Alexandria University in Elminia, in Cairo, in Ain Shams, but it is Al Halwan University that offers the one major program in art history. And as I said, what happens when there is such a delayed start for the recording of art history or teaching art history? It means that there hasn't been enough funding or enough scholarship prior to that. So these moments that Neda is talking about, the reasons they reverted back to the artists and the writing of the artists, is that the art historians never had the funding, the opportunities to actually record or do in-depth research on any of these topics. So when I started in the late 60s, I was fortunate that I was in Beirut, so there was access to some material, but not enough, and I was still too young to consider research that we are trying to do now. We now have more access to this material, but not enough. So archives are dispersed all over. Libraries have been destroyed. So most of the young scholars are traveling to the British Library, to France, to the Bibliothèque, to New York, looking for resources, rather than you would think in Cairo, for example, where access is very difficult. So in other words, we're now looking at collecting these archives of these artists and digitizing them now. We hope to have such a project at NYU where we can preserve the present for the future scholars. And this way they would not have to give a statement like this one, that was not much as far as art history written before this period that we can look at. I also did some research in the 80s and 90s, and more recently looking at what textbooks are used in teaching art history. For example, at Halwan University, where we have a large number of students in art history program, and most of the books are actually translation of Western art. So we are now looking at how we teach in the West and saying we need to change that, while many of the Arab universities are still teaching the old method, with a few exceptions here and there. So if you count the number of courses in Coptic art, in Islamic art, and ancient Egyptian art, there are many of them and many teaching those, and including popular art as well. But when it comes to modern contemporary art of Egypt and Egyptian artists, these are very rare. And therefore, at times in Egypt, artists have to pitch in also and contribute by mentoring these students outside the university, as you know, has been done by institutions such as Contemporary Image Collective and other artists who have taken it upon themselves to mentor these young scholars outside, whether in art practice or in art history.
If I can also add, actually, it's really interesting what Shelwa was saying, because even till today, programs that teach art history in the same way, for example, that we know it around the world, are new. So, teaching one course or two courses is one thing, but to have a College of Fine Arts at the University of Baghdad since the 1940s, right? And throughout that, yes, they teach Mesopotamian art from translated books, although, people like the late Donnie George and others who were doing their own archaeology, Iraqi archaeologists, were adding to the literature. But when it came to the modern contemporary, they knew the Renaissance, they knew the Baroque, but they didn't know Su'ad al-Attar. They did not know, the history, the modern history of their own country, which is, really interesting, given that you can even see their work in the museum. So, that is an interesting phenomenon, to say the least. But also, that MoMA book that I just mentioned, we were particularly interested in not doing secondary documents, only primary, meaning that, no written art history, because, as Shelwa said, archives are not available. Now, the book is mainly intended for English-speaking world, and so, everything was translated from Arabic and French, with very little intervention from us, the editors, because we really wanted to open up the ability for young scholars to be able to do research by translating some documents, but also referencing other ones. There have been, in the publishing of art history on the Arab world in English, let's say, several documents that are always referenced, but never really found. People just sort of repeat the reference of it, quote the same thing. And so it wasn't easy to actually find some of those documents that we've known to have been referenced, and then to translate them was a whole different story. So that was a lot of fun, trying to translate text from Sudan, from Egypt, from Palestine, from Iraq, and mix between the standardized Arabic and the colloquial, and the different meanings that are, meant, and then to translate all of that in English. So that was, not a simple task. But we do need to, as Shelwa said, have access to archives, digitize archives. Artists, even the modern artists, are more aware now that they need to do that to their own work. So, they are increasingly collecting anything that is published about them, their work, archiving it correctly, and documenting things, and so we have access to it. Yet we still don't have a place, a reservoir, a place where people can go to in the region to study those archives, the Arabic archives specifically, as opposed to things that are the colonial archives of the British Library.
With that said, that gap is it's a large one, and that definitely needs to be filled in order for us to satisfy, I think, the ambition that the region is looking to satisfy with their artists and their institutions. What is it, in your opinion, in both of you, how do you see that being satisfied? What is it that needs to be done besides having these, the archives space within, the region or the Arab world, or perhaps not even having to be here? I don't know how much you would say borders begin to affect the narrative of what we're looking at. So within your practice, looking at, understanding the idea of these man-made borders, and now both of you being, having left where you had initially come from, and how does that begin to, that relationship begin to affect your work and affect the way that you present your work?
The issue of borders is really interesting. On a personal level, like me as Nada, borders don't mean anything, because I was born in one place, grew up in a different place, and lived in a different place, and married from a different place. So borders mean nothing. But I don't know that when we talk about the history of art, for example, let's talk about Iraq. I don't know that Iraq can afford to be borderless at the moment, because this is the issue with the global. To what extent do we forfeit identity and when the global is unequal? So, to talk about contemporary art in America, it's easy, it's simple. We don't need to qualify. But when we, then throw in contemporary Iraqi artists without their identity, then they're just sort of swallowed up by the whole notion of the global without having the space initially. This is a dilemma for me. But I think one of the things we need to do is not only the archive issue. We feel the urgency to write and to publish, which is great, and we need to do that. But that also means that some of what is published becomes sloppy. It's messy. It's not really, to actually publish an academic book, it would take minimum 5 years. This MoMA book, we've been working on it for 6 years. It's not out yet. Things take time because they need to be peer-reviewed, refereed. They need to be, the references worked out. They need to have a sound, argument. So one of the things that is happening to satisfy the lack of literature is the sort of, quick publications, which in my opinion are dangerous because they set a standard for something that, then will at one point requires to be unpacked again. I was just talking the other day with Shelwa about, for example, everything we know about Jawad Salim in Iraqi art was written by Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, who was a contemporary of Jawad Salim. But the reality is no one has ever looked at the work again, and everyone just repeats what Jabra has written. And we've not had the time to look and think, do we agree with that or not? So I think we need to slow down. There is a whole other issue about methodologies and how do we write about art, modern art particularly, from the Arab world while we're all trained in Western methodologies. There are many issues that need to be nuanced and resolved before we sort of just jump in, which is sort of some of what's happening. But on the other hand, we have a lot more of essays and articles written by young scholars that are going in depth into, specific artists or specific periods, which only enrich the scholarship. So, they're both happening.
So critical thinking, I guess, would be a key point that needs to be said and highlighted again and again.
Well, when you talk about border or across border, as the title says, I can see that in contemporary art, where an example of this is the art fair, where you can, these artists are crossing borders and you can understand it within the global context of the art market. But when you're talking about the modern period or early art, then we really need to go, as Nada said, more in-depth understanding of what was happening at that time for the young scholars now who did not live during that period or have not been, had not studied Arab history to begin with, let alone Arab art history. So many of the younger scholars who have been trying to enter programs, PhD programs in the West, for example, the United States. I remember in the 80s where we had major difficulty, as I did, because there were no other, the university would discourage.
Same in the 90s.
Yeah, same in the 90s, exactly. To discourage the students from dedicating their dissertation and research to the Arab art. Because there were no other professors at the university, and the notion of Arab art just didn't exist at that time. So I remember that I had to support students through letters of recommendations, and that eventually, even up to 2005, we had a student at MIT who had was challenged about her choice of discipline. And the reason for that is they think that the graduates will have found difficulty finding a job. Who would hire someone with a specialty in art of the Arab world or a topic related to that? That was the case up to 2005 and only changed later on. So that also contributes to the lack of documentation, lack of support for the art. Although in cases such as the art market, of course, the more you write, the more scholarship about the artwork, the higher the value of that art. So ironically, that with all the funds that are being now spent on purchasing and acquiring collection, at the same time there isn't enough investment in scholarship, in research. And this is ironic because of this relationship, direct relationship to the market. And I think there needs to be more proper scholarship done at university level. And we're delighted to know now, for example, the Art Jameel are going to be focusing on a research project for the Gulf, the GCC countries. That will also contribute to safeguarding the material, archiving, etc. So we can see there are steps towards that in different Arab countries. But with the situation the way it is, it's not taking off. Look at what Beirut is in danger now. And the whole region is at another crossroad. So,
but also to add to this, it's because, and kind of relates to what I was talking about, the urgency of writing. See, even though there is some support now in the region for writing, people contact me and want me to write something in 2 months. You know, I mean, it doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way.
A quick fix.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a quick fix, and the deadlines are always very short, and then, you know, they're unhappy when I say I'm sorry. You know, I need time. I need time to study the thing before I even write about it. But in like Sala was saying, with the contemporary, the issue of borders is so much easier to deal with. And even in many museums, I know we're not talking about museums, but in museums in the US, for example, where Islamic art collections are now including contemporary, they find it easy to do so, but the modern is a very different story. And so while, you know, yes, partly it was in the 80s and the 90s, there was no one who could supervise, you know, a study on modern Arab art, but the reality is the notion of modern Arab art was not accepted because there was no such a thing. Even till today, with everything that we're still working on, that is a debatable issue about what is, because modernism, while there are various efforts of trying to open up, you know, there was alternative modernisms at one point, there was multiple modernities at another point, things that are all to be sort of refuted on various levels. But there is a move now, like in Berkeley, they're teaching global modernism with the faculty trying to organize among them so they can teach a more sort of equal number of parts of the world, as opposed to starting, you know, with the Western. So the problem with this means that there is a larger political situation that is unresolved when it comes to the modern Arab. So it's not just a simple lack of information or literature. I think there is a bigger problem where the modern Arab world itself is in question, as opposed to, you know, its own production of the visual.
So displaced to a degree, would you agree that it hasn't found its place within the timeline of art history, or how would you argue?
Well, I mean, you know, how does it find its space? It doesn't. I mean, it's the canon of art history that has set the spaces, and the modern Arab art is not there, largely. Starting to push itself in. I mean, we think it's a major accomplishment that MoMA is publishing this primary document as part of its international document program. But I mean, we're still pushing, so it's not resolved yet. It's so much easier to accept the contemporary from the region as equal contemporary global, but not the modern yet. The modern is still questioned.
Yeah, I agree. The modern is the challenge, and it is not about including a certain artist from the Arab world in plural modernity, such as the exhibit that was organized at Saint Pompidou a few years ago. It is rather, as I said, the art in context. So there needs to be this reaching out to this region and finally accepting that there is a modernism in this region that defined by this region. So it's maybe a different type of modernism. So that has to be accepted. When that is accepted, then we will have more in-depth, I think, understanding of the art of such as Salahi and Salwa Rawda Shair. And because, for example, I was delighted when the Tate decided to do one solo show and quite an impressive one for Salwa Rawda Shair. But my question would be, how much time are the curators dedicating to the research and continue to do research on Salwa Rawda Shair in the future, now that they have a collection? So how much are they invested in this art from this region? Not just by including it in one exhibit or even a solo exhibit, but in the scholarship, in the research that they will continue to conduct. So what comes next in what I'm trying to say? So it's not a matter of just including it there, because that gives you a more horizontal understanding of this art. We need more in-depth and take a vertical distance.
But also, I mean, the problem is, of course, that we're looking to Western institutions to validate us. And that is one of the major problems. And that was part of the discussion also yesterday between Omar Khalif and Sultan Qasim, is that while, you know, by us happy that the West acknowledges us, we sort of give them more power. And I think we need to get to the point where it's not about even a different modernism. It is about a modernism, but that is local, that is specific, like the European modernism is local and specific to it. To stop the comparison. I think we need to find the way to stop the comparison, but we also need more things happening in the region. We need knowledge that originates in the region as opposed to being imported all the time. And yes, okay, I don't think about myself as just American. I am an Arab American or whatever, they want to classify me as. And so I feel like I am, from both regions. That's fine. But we need more initiatives that take place here in the region as opposed to us second generations or whatever who are in the West and are doing the work.
So now we have more museums. I mean, with the Louvre opening now. And
the Louvre is a French museum.
Yes, well, we'll have some space in it for the Arab world, and I think that hopefully they will be going into that direction at least. But for Saloua, for example, it would have been so wonderful to have the solo exhibit during her lifetime. And I know that she would have been more impressed by having that show in Beirut rather than London. Knowing Saloua and having interviewed her, and I know that this is what she was hoping for, to have not just an exhibit, but have her work commissioned as large-scale public artwork in Beirut, in Arab cities. And that she told me directly. And so, like Neda said, we really need to look inward first and not to necessarily always look at our art in relation to the West. So we're going to have a crooked neck looking at the West all the time. We have to also look around us.
I think actually, since we mentioned the Louvre, I'm not going to talk about the Louvre, but I just want to say that it was kind of interesting to see that in the modern halls in the Louvre, there was Saloua and Ibrahim Salahi. We were joking and saying, so they graduated through the Tate to be included in the modern section. That's all I'm saying.
With that said, I'm trying not to go into that rabbit hole, so I'll try to move away from it. But I'm just going to touch one point, and then maybe we can move away. But I think the impact of these Western institutions on the Arab artists it's almost like a romantic idea, and there's a sense of like savior, like they're coming to save this one artist. And out of curiosity with regards to academia, how does that begin to change the course of the subjects that you're looking at within universities? When you have an artist at the Tate, for example, that is from the region, or at the MoMA, so on and so forth. How does that, what does it do to the artist and what does it do to the region? And for me, it's always a general sense of romanticism when you arrive. You go and you see something and it's so detached, and artwork that comes from a region, in my opinion, generally, when it's in the region, it's always much more impactful because there is sense between it and the landscape that it's in it. Yeah.
I mean, of course, we're all happy to see all these artists, enter the canon of, as someone who lives in the West, I want this to happen in the West, but I want this to happen for the Western audience, right? Not necessarily for the validation of the artist, because I want those artists to enter the canon and be part of what I can refer my students to, right? So I think it's a great thing. With the contemporary, it's much easier because, like I said, some of the artists whose work is showing here in the fair, like they say, hey, Kahraman, okay, she lives in the U.S., so she is accessible to my students and accessible as a global artist. So that's a different, easier story. But for the modernists, we are happy when they come in. Yes, that generates some literature, but like Saloua said, it's what happens after that doesn't seem to have, been worked out. And again, there are only few of us who work on the modern period, so there's only so much we can do. Granted, it takes much longer, and so, but are these Western institutions then invested in this as a form of their collection and the knowledge of their collection, other than that one catalog that was published at the opening? It's something we don't know yet.
Great. On that note, I'd like to start to close up this panel and then open up the floor to questions. I'm very interested in the idea of identity being almost like an immediate tag with, with the arts, like the way we describe ourselves as, artists of the region, Arab artists, and that is such a broad term that it differs from, from emirate to emirate, let alone border to border, and from region to region within the Arab world. And I'd like to just understand how much, how if you find it necessary to have that title as Arab artist. I mean, you mentioned Have, and Have is very much she's an international artist. So what makes her that, as opposed to an artist that is labeled immediately with, say, Iraqi or Arab artist? What would you say the difference is? Although her work is very much in reference to females from the region, looking at the region specifically.
Well, actually, she looks at Iraq specifically because she's engaging with certain aspects. So I think the issue of identity at the moment is very much a matter of choice. And so, someone like Hay, because I interviewed her recently, she chooses to identify intellectually and emotionally with Iraq, right? So it's a different form of identity than, this is my nationality type of thing. But, I mean, you talk about how general a notion like an Arab artist is, imagine then what a global artist means. So we clearly, identity is, has different importance and significance at different times. So to talk about, let's say, someone like Jawad Salim, an Iraqi artist, during his period of time, it was difficult to talk about him as international, and he was engaged internationally as well. But he had a specific goal. To some extent, the identity is defined by its context, by its time, by the work of the artists themselves, of how you want to look at that identity. And it's not a solid, confining thing. It's a very sort of evolving, very lucid sort of, shifting discourse of multiple notions. And the notion of Arab, which is something not popular today, but for us modernists remains popular, it was a very sort of, again, it was a discourse of multiplicity. So it's not defining as in the pan-Arab, of Gamal Abdel Nasser. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a cultural intersection, interaction that, we define as Arab at a specific certain moment that, has its own significance and reason.
I mean, looking at Arab identity, I always say, the Arab Spring is Arab Spring. It's not Middle Eastern Spring. I always remind my students that. So there is the notion of Arab is not over it. It's still there. And it depends on the artist and where their association is. But if we look back again to the modern period, in the 70s, the Arab art associations were very strong. And now you hardly have, except for the Fine Art Society here, this kind of collegiate collaboration actually between artists from the Arab region. But just looking at the Arab Biennale that took place in Baghdad and brought so many Arab artists together, and they had this dialogue going on at that time, which we don't see as much now. We see them dialoguing, but not necessarily with each other as they used to. So there was definitely an Arab art movement during that period, which we do not see now. And that's where I see the disparity between actually individual identity and the collective identity within the art scene. There's a difference here.
On that note, if anybody has questions from the audience, we'll be happy to take them.
Thank you very much for the talk. It may be a bit contentious to ask, I think, historians about maybe the present moment, but I'd be interested in hearing what you thought your peers in 20 or 30 years will describe what's happening in the Gulf today, what's happening in UAE, what's happening in Saudi Arabia, from the perspective of sort of collection and a lot of young artists that are joining the movement. I'd like to hear your perceptions on that.
Tariq, could you just repeat that one more time?
Sure.
Thank you.
I guess I'm asking how you think historians in 20 or 30 years will describe what's happening today, what's happening here in the region. I don't want to reference directly what's happening down the road, but we can even look at museums that are opening in Palestine, the growing art movement, I think, in Saudi Arabia. So is there something more collective that's happening? Is it sort of individual in terms of what's happening within each space, or each country, or each society? How do you think it's going to be sort of narrated?
I mean, it's difficult to try to predict 20, 30 years ago. I mean, the thing is, the reality is, I think all art historians have issue even sort of understanding and defining what is the contemporary moment. So in all around the world. So, and that is something that we have not yet resolved to figure out how to even talk about it, let alone in the region. So we can only hope that they will be very gentle to us. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, it's a very difficult question. I see what you're asking and I see where that is going. But I mean, things have to be understood within the context of what is happening. There is a reason why there's a certain development happening in Saudi Arabia at the moment or here. And so, this will be studied within its own context. Salo, you have something else to say?
Not really, it just emphasizes the need for preserving more of the archives for the future generations, so that they would need to consult the archives rather than Google or Google
You don't know what
Scholar.
Google will be.
Because this is unfortunately what's happening. Like Neda said, we have all these catalogs, but they don't have really in-depth research-based scholarship, and so it's we can't just write an essay in 1 week until just to have this quick turnaround. And hopefully the future generation will have more serious and better libraries to work with as well.
I think on that note, also touching base on what you were saying, Tariq, about the developments within the region, for me it was very gratifying to see what Abuظbي Art as a platform has done this year, to see all of these young curators, artists, and thinkers come together and really connect. And for me, I think the end goal, in order to have an art history that is comprehensive, we need to create this network. And this network needs to be created by reaching out to these individuals, institutions, thinkers, and writers. And then from that, you can accumulate and then document so that you don't have that loss for the future generations. And then you create that backbone, that art history that is, in my opinion, very, very obviously missing when you're looking at the Gulf region specifically.
No, but to add to this, actually, as an outsider who comes to the region, at occasions like this, I am increasingly impressed by what the youth is doing and the level of consciousness and awareness that they're having. So they're taking the educations, even if they are being educated at, Western institutions, but they are actually taking it to figure out what to do with it for the local, which is a very, very promising thing that didn't exist, let's say, 10 years ago. So, there is much hope that it would be a much better world in 20, 30 years.
Any other questions?
Thank you both for an amazing talk. I thought, Neda, what you mentioned about regional specificity, because we talk so much about the global, and I thought that was actually very compelling because, and what you were talking about, that missing link about the modernist era, I'm still wondering if there isn't an issue, if you could maybe talk about, maybe also the question about how Islamic art or ancient art of the region is still questioning its own methodology, and the fact that regionally you don't still have that many scholars even in ancient art and that have that kind of regional specificity, whether you're in Iraq or you're in Syria or you're in Turkey or you're even here. Maybe could that be the missing link between the contemporary and even the fact that between what we call Islamic art, which again is such a...
In the contemporary. Now, of course, that kind of bypasses that whole modern period that we cannot figure out, or the historians can't figure out what to do with. And so that creates, and then there was a long debate about is there something called contemporary Islamic art or not, and how do we look at that? Because the modern seems to be predicated on the notion of a rupture, and that rupture is not resolved. I think it's us who even started saying this narrative, are now questioning things because we're having more access to archives. We're seeing new stories that could be told, and then by trying to consolidate and figure out that there's no such thing as complete rupture, right? Because life has continuity. So we just got to figure out how to negotiate that and have a sort of more a smoother sort of transitions within the own history to sort of write that history from a different point of view. But like even Saloua said, if Islamic art and the ancient are taught from translated books. But the happy news is that there are more people like me who are writing revisionist history in various forms, right? Because we're thinking, well, we can't just look at it from this point of view because this is what was happening. We're talking to people, we're finding new archives. That's why archives are so important, because they tell us different things than the perceived perception that we all grew up on. We have to realize that even my education in Baghdad in high school was really an important education. So what I learned about the history of my own country was taught to me through the eyes of Western history. And so, there's so much still to be done before we can resolve these issues. But the good news is that, things are happening at least. So, there are efforts for that.
There is another side to this. Actually, there was a rupture in the modern period from the Islamic period, because if there is continuity, then we need to respect the crafts as fine arts as well. This kind of differentiation existed because of the Western influence. And actually, during the colonial period, for example, in Morocco, the French governance of Morocco particularly emphasized and supported the crafts more than the fine arts. And the same for, but not exactly the same, actually, for Tunisia and Algeria, where the galleries and the museum opened there early on in Algeria in the 19th century, but for the benefit of the foreign European artists and not the locals as much, but eventually the locals ended getting some advantage there. But what I'm trying to say is that this conversation, I remember it started some time ago. So I don't know why they just have a conference about it now. Exactly.
It's one of many other
One of many, right. It's not, so there is an ongoing discussion. But again, it is taking opportunities. When the very first exhibit in the West that referenced contemporary art as Islamic art was in New York not long ago. Before that, it was, if you just look at a list of exhibitions in the West, there is a great deal to glean from that list, particularly in relation to this topic. And why was that exhibit at the MoMA referenced as contemporary, within the context of contemporary Islamic art to some extent? So there are institutions that find it in their own advantage to use the word Islamic, particularly now because of the visitors. The visitors are curious about this culture, Islam, and what's happening in this region, and that draws in more publicity than a thematic title for an exhibition. I think this is also, there are several reasons. This is quite a huge topic to refer to, but short time here.
We have time for one more question. I think Kareem has a question in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you and for Munira for a very insightful and great talk. I just had a question with regards to sort of strategy when contextualizing the modern. In the work that we do at Barjeel Art Foundation, one of the most difficult things is sort of translating what modern Arab art is and translating this sort of this particular modernism. And I think this is a question that goes back, was it Jawad Salim in 1953 in the United States was asked this question about what he was doing, and 60 years later, we're still sort of asking or answering the same question. But what strategies do both of you, Neda and Saloua, employ to sort of contextualize this particular modern period on its own terms? for your students?
Well, first of all, the students come in from different backgrounds, so I do adjust the course based on their knowledge of history and what courses they have taken. It is very difficult and almost impossible to teach modern period without knowledge of art history and the politics of this region. So I actually have a new strategy now, so that the course is morphed into another one called Contemporary Art and Politics of the Arab World. And I have left the modern period to be taught within core classes such as abstraction or other courses that are more sort of within the global context. So we need to narrow down these courses, and these general, as I said earlier, survey type courses or survey type exhibition do not benefit anyone. It just confuses the picture. And so that's one way of doing it.
No, I agree with that, but also, I mean, to think about when you teach modernism, even just called modernism, and it's going to start with the Impressionist or just pre-Impressionist, you still have to put the, teach the context. You cannot expect my students who are sitting in Denton, Texas, to actually know the history of Europe of the 19th and 20th century. So you have to teach them that context. So I do the same when, when I'm teaching modern, let's say, Iraqi art, and I want to talk about Jawad Salim. And aside from doing that, there are two words that are banned from my class: influence and inspiration. Those are two words that are not allowed to be used, because the influence seems to always be like, I don't know, some European artist who has influenced, and bridging the gap also doesn't exist in my discourse. So there's no gap, and if there are gaps, let them be. The artists were not influenced, they were informed by certain aspects of what they were studies, and there is no inspiration that comes divinely from anywhere. It is hard work and agency for the artist. So, and I teach it within its own context, within the context of the history and politics of Iraq, let's say, itself. So.
Yeah, I just want to add quickly that there are resources available. For example, since 2003 and 4, there is the timeline of art history, and I contributed a large number, maybe 12 pages to that, which sort of is a brief summary of the history of art in this region from 1900 to 2003. So it kind of also includes the political history as well as the history of the development of art. And that gives a novice person, someone who just wants to have an introduction, a way to study the region chronologically, at least, to find out what happened during, like Neda said, she teaches per decade. This is important to put up. I put up the year 1967 the other day, and none in the class knew what happened in this region in 1967. So, and we had a whole conference on art in 1967, so I wanted to get into that, but I couldn't before, talking about this. So I've been plugging along these dates, whether having to do with us or 1979. I mean, these are key dates for this region that are important.
And that Met timeline is incredibly, useful for my courses and is on every syllabus. So thank you, Sylvia, for doing that.
Thank you, Salwa. Thank you, Neda. It's been a pleasure and an honor to share the stage with the both of you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this talk. Our next panel is at 6 o'clock. I hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you.